Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor. We're so pleased to welcome Dawnie Walton back to our At Home with Literati series, this time to celebrate her debut novel, The Final Revival of Opal and Nev, and joined in conversation this evening by VV Ganeshananthan. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be sharing links to purchase The Final Revival of Opal and Nev from Literati. And of course, if you are watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books from Literati in the description directly below me. But if you're watching live, you can submit questions using the Q&A portion of the webinar that's available to you at the bottom of your screen at any time, and I will read a selection at the conclusion of the reading and conversation this evening. As a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. I now will introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Dawnie Walton is a fiction writer and journalist whose work explores identity, place, and the influence of pop culture. She has won fellowships from the MacDowell Colony and the Tin House Summer Workshop and earned her MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Previously, she worked as an executive level editor for magazine and multimedia brands, including Essence, Entertainment Weekly, Getty Images, and Life. A native of Jacksonville, Florida, she now lives with her husband in Brooklyn. And V.V. Ganeshananthan is the author of a novel, Love Marriage. The book was longlisted for the Orange Prize and named one of the Washington Post's best book of the year. She teaches fiction and nonfiction writing in the MFA program at the University of Minnesota and has been visiting faculty in MFA programs at the University of Iowa and the University of Michigan. She is the co-host of the Fiction Nonfiction podcast on Literary Hub. They can't hear you, but they can sense you through the powers of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Suki Ganeshananthan and Dawnie Walton into your living rooms.
Thank you so much, John. Dawnie, it's so wonderful to be here. Congratulations on your already smashingly successful and just really brilliantly immersive and engrossing debut novel, which feels to me so real and alive. And I'm excited that tonight you said that you'll start us off with a reading.
I would love to. Thank you so much, Sugi, for joining me. Thank you, John and Literati, for hosting us on a Friday night. I have my sparkle on, my party earrings, even though I'm right here in my office in Brooklyn. So the final revival of Opal and Nev, and I'm going to just pull this over so I can see it, is about an interracial rock and roll duo on the early 1970s New York scene, and they rocket to fame in the wake of violence that breaks out at a record label showcase when a rival Southern rock band brandishes a Confederate flag on stage, and their drummer, a Black man named Jimmy Curtis, who also happens to be having an affair with Opal, is murdered. And 45 years later, Jimmy's daughter, Sunny, who wasn't even born yet when Jimmy was killed, has become the editor-in-chief of a music magazine called Oral. And she, in this book, is revisiting Opal and Nev's story because she wants to learn more about the father she never knew, but also because Opal and Nev are considering a 2016 reunion. So the book Sunny writes is an oral history, but once in a while she interjects with an editor's note. So I'm going to read from one of those editor's notes. And it is Sunny recounting the first time she ever heard Opal and Nev's music at age 14 in the main branch of the Philadelphia Public Library. It's a miracle their albums were even in the library's collection, among the Appalachian folk songs and orchestral arrangements of the Beatles' greatest hits. And perhaps that's a testament to the taste of the bespectacled young woman who managed the collection and wore an apartheid no button on her distressed denim jacket. But here they were, these taboo artifacts, not jazz, not R&B, not anything as boxable as that. And a thrill raced up my back to finally have them in my hands. I had heard Nev Charles's pop songs before, of course. 1986 was a huge year for him with his fifth solo album, the top 10 duet with Annie Lennox, and the kickoff of his third world tour. And I'd caught snippets of Opal's speaking voice when she showed up on television for whatever disaster she was promoting. But I'd never heard these full albums before, never been able to grasp the cardboard of polychrome and trace the letters of my father's name printed in the credits. For at least 2 weeks, I listened to the A and B sides every day, parked at the record player with the giant headphones perched carefully atop my head so as not to muss my curls in a way my mother would notice. Yes, I wore out that record and admired it too, patting my palms on my thighs in time with my father's rhythms, causing the librarian to smirk at me when I got to the drum fill on chalk white. Wow, I thought, my dad did this. Still, that album didn't hit me with the same force as things we've seen, the double LP that the label rushed out not long after the showcase. Its front cover featuring the simpler post-riot stage name, Opal and Nev, and the tops of their heads poking up from the bottom. On the left, her bare scalp oiled and glistening. On the right, his hair variegated in hues of red that intensified toward the roots, stiffened with product to mimic a flame. Between them, her raised fist was like an alien baby bursting into frame. This album had more screech, less bottom, and aside from a simple dedication for James Curtis III, in small blue script on the opposite cover, not one hint of my dad. I should not have loved it for exactly those reasons. Inexplicably, shamefully, I did. It's far from a perfect album. I doubt it would crack the top 1,000 of most colleagues' personal favorites. And sales-wise, every Nev Charles solo album afterward annihilates it. But the music, lyrics, and vocals on enough of its songs expressed a passion and a fury, a focus amid the discord, a give zero fucks freak flag bravado that felt, in some ways, like a tribute. Hearing it for the first time triggered what I can only describe as a fear response inside my body. I'm talking heart racing, palms sweating, tiny hairs on the back of my neck doing the wave. You gonna fight? This bald-headed bitch and her people seem to be asking me, daring me. Or you the kind that's partial to flight? I'd feel similar thrills years later through spins of NWA and Nirvana, through piercings and zip lines and experiments with everything from sex to Thai chili peppers. But there's nothing like the first time you take on a thing that scares the shit out of you and discover the intensity turns you all the way on. Pandora's box, the slippery slope, you know, my fellow fans, how it can be. Did you know you can check the records out? The anti-apartheid librarian asked me one day, and even though I didn't have my own record player, I smuggled home things we've seen anyway, just to have it physically near me, to be able to reach underneath my bed, past the hanging edge of my comforter and feel it lying there. I knew every strum and yelp by heart, scribbled lyrics from memory in the pages of my school notebooks among the formulas and equations, started mixing in original compositions too, preachy poems with metaphors about shepherds and sheep, fantasies about a band of unpopular kids taking over the headmaster's office, a not half bad takedown of Heart of Darkness. I never showed these to anyone, certainly not to my mother, whom I feared would burn my notebooks as contraband and send me away to some Bible camp. Not even to my friends at Haviland Day School, two goth girls with whom I'd forged a shy bond based on our mutual outsider status. Still, the ideas and passions of the artists I most admired took root inside me. She was building me fearless and strong, intellectual, creative. In other words, into the kind of badass chick my father would love. I didn't know back then that she was my benefactor on this road of self-discovery. And yet, as she'd been for many a weird Black girl before and after, Opal Jewel was already my idol. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawnie. It's great to hear you read from the book. Congratulations on, it's a hugely enjoyable book. And for me, I think it was so special to return to You were at Iowa when I was visiting faculty there, and I saw these opening pages. I've been wondering what happened to these characters.
So I have to break this down for anybody who's here. So Sugi was my very first workshop leader at Iowa. Fall of 2016, everyone is nervous who's first year, like terrified. And that class just opened up so much for me as a writer, which I think we're going to get into. But I just had to say that, like, it's such an honor to be here. Like, this is an event I've been looking forward to for a long time. So thanks again.
Yeah, it's that class was so fun, and I think such a wonderful group of people. And really, like, you brought in this bit of manuscript, and it was so wholly imagined, right? It's an invented history. And yet, as people just heard, I mean, one of the things about both Sunny, the editor of the narrative, the writer of the narrative in some sense, its curator, she's a weird Black chick, and so is Opal Jewel. And so you invented a history, and then you invented a plausible weirdness, a series of events to fit inside that. Can you talk a little bit? Because even when you turned in those first pages, the Rivington Showcase, which is where the incident that you referred to as you were before the reading, that incident is referred to in the opening pages. And I've been waiting years to read about the Rivington Showcase. So can you talk a little bit about inventing these histories?
Yeah, sure. So the book started really as like straight oral history, straight, like just the characters on the page raw. And that for me was the flow I got into in writing. And it felt natural to me, I think, because I had worked as a journalist and I was familiar with the form. And for some reason, like ironically, the rigidity of the form gave me a certain freedom within the rigidity. And so, I was writing these characters and letting them lead me where, they would. And I always knew that there would sort of be a pivotal moment that happens at this concert. But the first pages I brought in for this workshop was just sort of, I think it was like just interviews with Opal about her childhood. And, my classmates and you were like, this seems cool. This is interesting. We really like this. This has some heat to it. But we're really curious about who they're talking to, who is the person on the receiving end of these stories and who is making the decision about how they're woven together. And that put a little nugget in my mind. And I remember I came to your office hours and I said, listen, I have this idea. I don't know if this is crazy, but there was a little piece much later in the manuscript. It was a part you hadn't read yet, actually. And it was a character speaking for like one paragraph about how Opal Jewel had an affair with her father before she was even born. And then her father was killed and Opal felt bad about it. And so she gives the character's mother money to pay for the daughter's schooling. And I always was sort of fascinated, and I thought there was a lot more story there. And so I was like, I think I showed that little nugget to you. And I said, what if I pull this character out to the foreground and make her, someone who is giving some current context to this history, because there's really two timelines. There's the 1971 timeline, and then there's the 2016 timeline. So what if we had a character in the modern day who was almost a bit like a mirror for Opal in the sense that she is an only one in her field? And I think I showed you like my first attempt at like an opening editor's note. And you were like, lean into this. Yes. Yes. And that's how Sunny was born, through that workshop and through your guidance. And it just gave the novel so much propulsion, because then I knew that I was leading up to a current moment in 2016. Also that semester, the fall of 2016 is when, of course, He Who Shall Not Be Named was elected to office. And that also kind of fired up some urgency in me as a writer. And yeah, it just was a weaving that I was doing all that semester.
It's really, yeah, it's very cool to see Sunny on the page. And again, this sort of series of invented histories, those opening pages where she goes to see Opal and to talk to her. And then it all leads with this great propulsion because Sunny wants things out of this project. And in the scene that you just read, again, we see this reference to Opal and Nev's first album, Polychrome. And
Yeah.
this is invented in such wonderful detail, like all of the tracks. It's got a theme. It's got these colors running through it. I always know what Opal is wearing. Um, can you talk about inventing this music?
Yeah. I think that like the sound and the music really came from just like having fun with writing lyrics, like fake lyrics. And the sound sort of followed from that. So, I started writing Nev, who, is the character, like he's the one front and center at the beginning. Like Polychrome is actually Nev's album. And Opal comes on as like a featured singer because Nev's first record it flopped. And so his label honcho, Howie Kelly, is sort of looking at the charts and seeing what's hot. And what's hot is Gimme Shelter, which is the Rolling Stones song with Mary Clayton. So Howie's just like, he's willing to do anything that works. So he's like, I got a British guy here. I'm going to pair him with a Black girl that has a voice, and we're going to see what happens on this next one. And so that's how, Opal and Nev get together. But Nev is kind of coming out of a singer-songwriter, kind of folky, Greenwich Village kind of like sensibility, where he is writing, kind of like slightly quirky songs, but, nothing too wild and out there. But as they evolve, as they go into the showcase, I always see the showcases, they go in as one kind of artist and they come out the other. Mainly because of the force of Opal and her kind of reaction in the wake of this showcase and her sort of, I don't want to radicalization, her more like political stances, and the music follows that. So the music gets harder. They become more like partners, but there's always like an interesting power dynamic happening between the two of them. And at the peak of their fame, Opal is actually the one who is the more influential on their sound. And it becomes like edgier and more interesting, but also in some cases, like a little bit ahead of its time in a way that is sometimes inaccessible to people. Like they don't understand what it is because they haven't heard anything like it before. That's always kind of like what I wanted the sound to feel like. And then when they do eventually go their separate ways, they sort of lean into the instincts that they had in the first place. And so Nev becomes like more of like, pop sensibility character. And then Opal she has a brief moment of wanting to not feel like she's in a box anymore, but she eventually sort of leans into the things that make her memorable as an artist. And so that's kind of like how the music ebbs and flows through the book.
Interesting because so many of the descriptions of the music offer the same sort of pleasure that I get from reading music reviews of music that I maybe haven't heard yet or concerts I didn't get to go to.
Oh, that's cool. That's hugely flattering. Thank you. I love music criticism.
And I think, yes, so much of the same sort of joy of descriptive, like the sort of vicarious feeling I get of when I read a great concert review and I'm like, I kind of think I might know what it would have been like to be there. That's very powerful. And I'm curious, listening to you talk about these characters who have these very definite arcs. Is there a turn in the story that, as you were writing it, you were talking about playing around how did these characters surprise you, or what did they do, or what about the story
Mm.
did not go the way that you had originally thought, besides some
So,
those which we've talked about?
yeah. So, um, when I started writing this, I had no idea what I was doing. I did not know how to write a novel. I don't know that I do now, honestly. I know, right? Like, how do you write a
Nobody.
novel? But I probably took an approach that no formal teacher would approve. And that was just, I kind of just wrote it as it went. Like, I just let the characters go, and I didn't know what was going to happen often from scene to scene. And I would do this thing where, like, I would always kind of be writing as far as like my headlights could see. Like, I'm driving in the dark in a car. There's another writer who uses this analogy, and I'm stealing from them, but you're in a car on a dark road, and the only thing you can see is like right in front of you, like what your headlights illuminate. And that's how I was writing this. And so, like, I would reach a point where like I couldn't see anymore. Like, it got too foggy. And then I would, I remember one day I went to, I think it was Jones Beach here. And I said, I'm not coming back to the city until I figure out what happens next. And I sort of was like going like that. And what happened was that one of the characters did something that took me by total surprise. I can't talk about it too much because it's a huge spoiler, but it's the moment that sort of ends part one of the book, sort of the halfway point of the book. And I didn't expect that character to do that. And I'd heard writers talk about characters surprising them before, but I didn't really believe that it was something that could actually happen until it happened. Like, has that happened to you when you're writing, where a character shocks you?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's fun, but then you have to contend with it.
But then exactly, you have to wrestle with so much, like not just what happens next, but what it means for the character, like how you've built the character to that point and where you're taking them from that point. And so when I hit that moment, I was completely stuck for a full semester. I took that semester off from working on the novel, actually, and I turned to short stories until I could figure out what happened next.
Wow.
So, yeah. But then slowly I kind of figured it out. And then, I will say that writing the second half of this book was enormously difficult. It was enormously difficult and revised over and over again to get the right pacing, the right tone, to cut it because it was a lot longer. So yeah, I would not recommend that people write a novel that way. But in a way, like, I don't know, on the other hand, like, I don't know if certain things would have happened. Those surprises that sort of changed the trajectory of the book in a really great way. I don't know if it would have happened if I didn't approach it in that way. And that it would like be that surprising but inevitable moment that writers kind of dream about having.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were talking a little bit earlier about the fall of 2016 was certainly a challenging time because of He Who Shall Not Be Named, et cetera. And one of the things that was interesting as I was reading the story were the ways that things that we're talking about now, which of course, I don't know, people will sort of say, oh, everyone's talking about X. And then people maybe from community X are like, that thing has been happening for some time.
It's happening. Right.
And the story sort of offered these commentaries, or not, I don't know, not commentaries because it doesn't editorialize in that way exactly, but sort of events and parts of this story that connect to things that are going on in our political conversation now. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, these characters have strong opinions, they argue. I mean, there's the Confederate flag that you mentioned in your setup. And yeah, can you talk a little bit about engaging some of those symbols?
Yeah, I always knew that there would be a political piece of the novel. I was already terrified of He Who Shall Not Be Named and was contending with that terror, um, especially leaving New York and going to Iowa and not knowing what that would be like. And I was also in your political fiction class. Remember, you taught that seminar, because I wanted to write something that felt very real and honest to some personal experiences that I've had without being preachy or overwhelming the fact that this is a story of real human people. Um, and as far as the Confederate flag, I mean, I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, so it was a symbol that I have grown up around all my life. In fact, the Bond Brothers, the Southern rock band, is sort of a riff on Leonard Skinner, who is from my hometown and who used Confederate iconography on all of their, on their stages, on their album covers. And in Jacksonville, it's not this way anymore. I mean, Jacksonville actually turned blue last election, which was amazing. Go Duval County. But when I was growing up, you would see the Confederate flag all over the place. It was in on keychains, in gas stations, you would see it on t-shirts or women in Confederate flag bikinis on the beach. It was like a huge thing. And as kids, what really knocks me out is how popular of a show the Dukes of Hazzard was. Like, even among Black kids, we loved it, but we had no idea. We thought the car was cool. But the car, the General Lee had the flag on the hood, and we had no idea. We were so little, we didn't know what it was. And now as an adult, I think about my parents and what that must have been like for them, like not wanting to disenchant your young child about why you shouldn't like this show. You know what I mean? It's just I was just talking and laughing with a friend of mine about that the other day. But I was sort of grappling with all of those things. And then, of course, in November, it was the election. I had already, I think, written the concert scene, the stuff with the Confederate flag. And I think that I had Chet Bond be a Trump supporter already on the 2016 timeline. But everything just felt after that much more urgent. And of course, it changes the ending a bit, without giving too much away, where the note that the book sort of lands on at the end.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that imagery and iconography. And you are from Jacksonville, Florida, and we are at one of my favorite bookstores, Literati, which is in Michigan. And Opal's story actually begins in Michigan.
That's right.
And
In Detroit.
yeah, can you talk about writing Michigan and imagining Michigan? And it's got a really distinctive place in music history, and Opal doesn't exactly fit.
Yeah. So I just loved, and I have to admit, I have never been to Detroit, and I'm really dying to go. But I chose Detroit for as Opal's hometown for a number of different reasons. One, as you said, it has such a rich musical legacy. Of course, you have Motown. Um, but you also have there was a Black proto-punk band called Death that's from Detroit. There was MC5, Iggy Pop. You had both iconic soul music and iconic gritty kind of underground rock and roll. And I liked those two things. And I also liked Detroit as a place of Black entrepreneurship and Black resistance. There is some Detroit history sort of woven in there. I think the riots there are happening the year that Opal graduates high school. So that's part of it as well. But also I picked Detroit because, so I went to Florida A&M University, which is HBCU in Tallahassee, Florida. And the year I went there was like a whole bunch of kids from Detroit who came in to the school. And they were all graduates of this high school, Cass Tech. And they came in like ready to take over the world. Like, and some of these people are still my friends, but they were so ambitious and so smart and so spirited and so confident in a way that I had not like experienced other people my age to be. And I thought there's got to be something happening. Like, what is happening in Detroit? And that was the kind of place that I wanted Opal to be from. Opal is very different. She is somewhat outcast as a child, but there's something in her spirit that is just like, she knows, like, despite whatever obstacles she's facing, that she's not going to give up, that she like deserves every drop of whatever acclaim she gets. She knows she's talented. She has this self-possession that I feel like I witnessed in my friends from Detroit. So that's why I picked Detroit, even though I've never been, hopefully after pandemic.
That's, yeah, as you were writing about these, her experiences there, one of the things that I love about the book is the way that it moves around the country and gives you also these different windows into the ways that regionalities collide. You mentioned the riot in Detroit that in '67, and how that plays in. And then there's also Opal and her sister spend time as children in Alabama.
Yes.
And so they go and they're these Detroit kids who get off a bus and are met by their very elegant aunt and uncle. And
Yeah.
can you talk about that
Yeah.
transition a little?
So I was thinking about, this is the other reason why I chose Detroit, actually. So I'm glad you said that, is because it was a major city of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South into northern cities looking for more opportunity, different kinds of lives. And being from the South myself, and I've lived in a whole lot of different places. It's so interesting that I feel like all Black American people are a little bit Southern because of that Great Migration. And so I wanted to kind of connect directly Opal to sort of an experience in the South with family. And I wanted to kind of dispel some myths about what that would have been like, because, I have her talking about, you know, she sort of jokes that she had this picture in her mind, like everybody down there picked cotton all day, like she didn't, you know what I mean? But actually she goes down to Birmingham, where her aunt and uncle that she's never met are from. And like materially, they actually have, a nicer life than Opal and her mother and her sister in the city of Detroit. And yet there are other things that are just untenable. And I wanted to kind of give her both of those American experiences, being Black, and showing the difficulties, the different difficulties in different places.
Those scenes are so striking. There's an incident that occurs in Alabama shortly after they arrive that has stayed with me. And then, of course, a huge chunk of the book takes place in New York, where you do live and where I have lived, and which you evoked so beautifully. Can you talk a little bit about writing a place that you know and love?
Yeah. So I've been in New York now over 20 years and lived in different boroughs and seen the city change so much in those 20 years, and always been um interested in the spirit of the city, especially the music of the city in this particular era that I'm writing about, the early 1970s. You know, I have Opal and Nev on the scene just before like CBGB opens, before like New York punk is really, you know, on the scene. And yet like things are bubbling, you know, and I wanted to capture that moment in time of New York in places like Max's Kansas City, which was this place near Union Square where Andy Warhol used to sort of hold court in the back room until, you know, I forget the year he was shot, but he stopped going out after that. But it still became a place, sort of a magnet for, you know, sort of outre figures, avant-garde people, everyone from Candy Darling to, you know, the Velvet Underground does a residency at Max's. And I like the idea of Opal finding a place finally where she felt like she's still an outsider in some ways, simply because she's Black and there's not a lot of Black people on that scene, not a lot. But she feels like her sort of stranger elements are appreciated and celebrated. And I feel like people feel that way about New York, very much so, that you can come to New York no matter who you are, and you can find your people, you know, who welcome you and accept you and celebrate you, and you can become the icon that you dream of being in New York. And for me, New York is about possibility. You know, you can make yourself totally over, and yeah, so that's what I was trying to evoke in the New York scenes.
They're so fun, especially if you have lived there or know the city at all. Made me wish I had lived there in the 70s. And yeah, there is also, yeah, a moment when Opal arrives and she sees someone like herself being totally confident.
Yeah.
And it kind of ignites her in a way that
Mm.
is really exciting.
Yeah.
And to watch her
Yeah.
go through all these artistic iterations is really fun. She tries on, metaphorically speaking, a hat, you know, and it's sort of like, well, maybe I don't want to be that person. I'll make
Yeah.
my own outfit this way. And she has assistance in doing that in the form of a best friend who's a stylist who she meets in New York, and they have a lot of fun inventing the way that she will present herself. And even though and so I thought that the book captures so beautifully these two things, like the joy of expressing yourself and presenting yourself both in sort of a performative way and then also actually making your art. And then also there are these little bits offered up by, I mean, sort of throughout the book. And Jimmy also says things like this, where there's a part where Opal, I don't think that this is a spoiler. Opal is less musically adept, let's say, than
Yes.
some of her compatriots. And Jimmy, the drummer in this band, takes her under his wing. And that's sort of how
Yeah.
their affair begins. And he teaches her things. And one of the reasons he teaches her is because he really resents that people sort of say, oh, that Black musician, they just have such natural, inexplicable, mystical
Right.
talent. And
Right.
he really
Right.
resents the work not being credited. And I felt like that was also such a genuine representation of the ways that artists can be misread. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, one of the other things that I hope this book gets across is that that importance of community and people who being in a community with people who look like you and who understand some of the frustrations that you may be dealing with. And when we were talking about New York a second ago, I think I was talking, you know, I was talking a lot about downtown, but actually Opal makes a very conscious choice to live in Harlem when she comes to New York, because um, she sort of innately knows that that's what she needs, not to lose that about herself. You know, she's very proud in her Blackness. And, you know, one of the things that like I wrote these scenes with such like love and infatuation for these characters. I was thinking about the connection and the friendship between Opal and Virgil. and how how Virgil is actually the kind of friend that will support you to the end of the earth, but also call you out on your shit in the way that community can do, and only community can do. And the same thing with Opal and her sister Pearl. As much as they bicker, you know, when Opal needs advice, she sometimes calls Pearl, and she might ignore that advice or make fun of that advice, but she still calls her sister. And so that is actually, you know, that is part of the reason why Jimmy and Opal have their affair, is because they are sort of the flies in buttermilk often, you know, and they find each other and they find a kinship, and they help each other grow. Well, Jimmy helps Opal grow as an artist, and it sort of blossoms into something very inappropriate between them. But, you know, it's sort of the bond that means a lot to them to sort of make it through this business and this world that they're in.
Yeah, all of these different relationships are so they're so believable and true to the relationships that I've seen and had inside and outside artistic worlds. I'm not a great musician, but I'm a musician, and sometimes, especially in creative writing workshops, I find that musical metaphors are actually the ones that I reach for, because they're often ways for me to talk about trusting intuition, or tuning your ear to something, and trying to teach yourself to hear it, which is a thing that some people do differently from each other, but is also something you can train yourself to do. Just looking at our time here, I know that we are going to have some questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we get to those. So just to remind our audience that you can use the Q&A function of this webinar to ask Dawnie some questions, but I'm going to ask a couple more. So Dawnie, can you talk a little bit about your relationship to music and your favorites and the things that you used for inspiration? Were you writing, listening to music? I know you have a Spotify playlist out there for this book.
I wish that I could write to music, but it's too distracting to me. I get caught up in the lyrics and the sound, and then I'm just like not able to focus. So I actually write in total silence, but I was listening to music. You know, those moments when you're writing, but you're not at the computer, when you're thinking in your head. So doing chores around the house or things like that. Or when I was doing like sort of more mindless tasks at the computer, I would have the Spotify on. And then of course, when I was doing research and thinking about the artists that influenced Opal, I was listening to a lot of their music, like Nona Hendrix and Betty Davis and Grace Jones and so many artists. But my personal relationship to music is that, you know, my family, both sides, are huge music lovers. I'm thinking, you know, my grandparents were into the jazz vocalists. So, you know, Dinah Washington, Sarah Vaughan, Lena Horne, which is how like Sonny's birth name is, portmanteau, is that the word for it? Of those artists. And then my parents were in their 20s in the 70s. And so the parties they went to were often structured around like, we're going to get together and we're going to listen to What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. So it was very sort of politically conscious music, beautiful soul music. So music was always around me. And then my curiosity was leading me toward other places when I got old enough to develop my own tastes. And I found that for whatever reason, I was really intrigued by rock and roll of the time, alternative rock, indie music. I was very much into a lot of the British bands. I loved like The Cure, and I love this band called Ride, and a lot of the shoegaze bands like My Bloody Valentine, which is like complete noise with like a little bit of singing in it. And then I liked a lot of the very sort of lyrical American bands. You know, I went through an REM thing, all these things, but the problem with it was that it felt kind of taboo for me to like, because I never saw people who looked like me making it. And that always really troubled me. And it felt like it was something that was off limits or wrong somehow. And so, part of developing Opal for me was creating that figure that I would have posted on my bedroom wall very proudly. Instead of, like Sunny, I have her talking about hiding the record under her bed. Like, that's often how I felt about the music that I liked, because I was afraid that somehow people were seeing it as defining who I was, that I wasn't proud to be who I was. And so if I created a figure who, I could look at with pride and say, well, this person makes this crazy music that I like, and she's awesome. Like, that's what I wanted.
That's great. John, I wonder if maybe we should go to the Q&A now.
Yeah, we just have one question so far, and so people again can submit their questions using the Q&A. And I think it's a question, Dawnie, that you've already touched on a bit when you were talking about the analogy of writing as far as your headlights go. But a viewer writes, which character surprised you the most while you were drafting them, and who went off in a different direction than you originally imagined? So if we maybe want to expound more on some of what you've already said up to that point.
Yeah, so Nev is definitely the character that took me by surprise the most. And, when he started, I kind of had him as a very affable, and he is affable and very charming in his way, in the way that we Americans tend to be a little besotted by people from England. Accents are cool, like all those things. And he's very clever and very witty. But I knew that I was going to take him into this moment of the showcase, and I didn't know like how he was going to come out of that. And I think that's the places where he just surprised me, was I didn't know how he was going to come out of that moment. And I started thinking of him, I was thinking about some of the most iconic white male rock stars, and I was thinking about how they carry a lot of privilege in the sense that they can kind of be chameleonic. And so I was thinking about what that actually means, when someone is changing their sound, their look, how it affects like the inside. And so he started sort of morphing and changing as a character for me as the story went along. Whereas someone like an Opal, she may really have the desire to change and to be that same kind of chameleon, but it's limited for her. There's an expectation around her. There's a box around her that doesn't work the same way.
A viewer writes, I absolutely devoured this book, so thank you for writing it. I love how close to the end we get Sunny's mom's perspective. How did you decide to carefully add that in?
There was a lot more of it, I will say that. There was a whole other aspect of this novel in an earlier draft. It was probably close to 50 pages that is about Sunny's backstory and about the complicated relationship she has to Opal and with her mother, who, of course, has very complicated feelings about Opal as her husband's mistress and as the person who was there that night when he was murdered, but also having accepted this money from Opal to give Sunny the best possible schooling that Sunny can get. And so, she's a very, you'll see it in the book, but her mother is very sort of reluctant to participate in any sense in this project that Sunny is doing. And so the portion that I had cut was a dialogue between Sunny and her mother And I loved it. I still do love it. I have it saved on my computer, but it just was not for this book. It kind of slowed the book down in a way. And so I tried to take the essence of those 50 pages, boil them down into a nice moment, I think, between Sunny and her mother that sort of set Sunny on a new path. So Corinne, the mother, is not in it very much, but she does have a huge impact in the moment that she does appear.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Viewer writes, Dawnie, first, those earrings are stunning. Second,
Thank you.
Sunny.
They are a gift from my friend Sarah Fuchs.
And the question, second, since Sunny is a magazine editor and you were too, could you speak to whether there are any autobiographical elements to her? Also, did you face similar successes or challenges as she did in that world?
Yeah, the climate in print media is it's really difficult, and it has been difficult for years now, as magazines and the influence of magazines sort of dwindle, and as properties try to like translate their importance to their digital platforms. And magazine editors, God bless them, it is a very stressful job. And a lot of the job is about like, we're trying to stay afloat, And I found the higher up you get in that world as an editor, like the more and more that you have to worry about that. And you have to think about the kind of like compromises that you have to make that you might not have made in the heyday of these publications when they had some power and some pull. You're forced to do like things that kind of make you cringe a little bit as like a trained journalist, things that would have been unconscionable when you started out in your career. And so I think like thinking about those kinds of compromises and walking that tightrope was something that, I think everyone in media has been dealing with for years. And it's something that becomes an issue very much for Sunny, but also her relationship to loving something that felt taboo, which I talked about, that's something that I felt as well. For Sunny, it's more directly like feeling complicated about loving Opal because she was her father's mistress. But for me, it was just rock and roll generally, like feeling it was off limits to me and feeling those complicated things. So yeah, I definitely think Sunny and I share some things in common.
Well, we have reached the top of the hour, but Dawnie Walton, Sugi Ganeshananthan, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. Of course, you can purchase the final revival of Opal and Nev. There are links in the chat. If you're watching us live, there's also a link to the Spotify playlist, and those links will also be available to you in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. But we hope to have you both in the store very soon.
I would love it.
That would be great.
Stone's throw from Detroit. And we hope you continue to stay well and be safe in the meantime. And to all of our viewers, we hope you continue to stay well as well. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. So take care and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dawnie.
Congratulations, Dawnie.
Thanks.
Bye, all.
Bye.